Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on a narrative that is, well, it's part conversion story, part fever dream, and part just profound metaphysical inquiry.
It's a really unique one.
So imagine this scene. You're digging your own grave in the middle of winter snow.
And not just anywhere.
No, right where everyone walks, the social heart of your community. Then you move into a ritual, drinking a single cup of this strangely, vividly sweet wine, even though you've been given a powerful warning.
And it culminates in this almost Herculean task.
Right. You're given a heavy, dense metal Plumb-Bob to drag up a vertical mountain path through deep snow until you make this radical choice to carry it instead.
It is a stunning set of symbolic actions, and our source material for this is, well, pretty unique. It's a deeply personal journal entry.
Detailing this vivid dream, right?
Exactly, which the dreamer then submitted for this unprecedented intellectual exercise. We have 5 distinct analytical readings.
5 of them.
We have traditional Catholic, Second Temple Rabbinic, Freudian, Jungian, and contemporary psychological methods, plus a Thomistic metaphysical commentary on top of it all.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because this is not just a summary of a dream. Our mission here is to use these diverse analytical tools to illuminate the core themes, the things that drive any serious internal transformation.
Right. The big questions.
How do we handle external authority? What is the true nature of a moral or a spiritual burden? And where do we find that plumb line, the straight measure, that dictates our vocation and our self-alignment?
We're essentially looking for the common thread that runs through all 5 of these systems when a soul is seeking, well, a radical change.
Precisely. And this deep dive really offers you, the listener, a rare opportunity to see these highly specific intellectual frameworks. I mean, from the rigor of Thomism to the depth of Jungian archetypes applied side by side.
To the exact same piece of highly charged internal evidence. It's almost like a shortcut to understanding the mechanics of interpretation itself.
And what happens when those systems all converge on this one idea? The idea of a life being radically, completely reshaped. All right, so before we get to the physics of the Plumb-Bob and the chemistry of that sweet wine, we absolutely have to establish the intellectual landscape of the dreamer.
We have to. This context doesn't just color the symbols, it really dictates the stakes.
It starts with a background that, well, we see it pretty often, a non-practicing Quaker.
Which establishes an initial baseline of, you could say, quietism, a focus on that internal, non-sacramental faith.
The inner light.
Right, seeking the inner light over external ritual or hierarchy. But his internal landscape was complicated, and it was complicated early on.
The source details a crucial early influence, what he calls a blessed exposure to Orthodox Hasidic Judaism.
In Burlington, Vermont, of all places, as a young man, he describes this community as Jedi-focused, loving, welcoming.
And he came very close to converting, he says. He felt the Holy Ghost was guiding him toward the strictures and community of the 10 Commandments and God's laws.
And that experience is absolutely essential because it implants the architectural language we see later in the dream.
The rabbis.
The rabbis, the dining hall, reconfigured like a synagogue, that whole sense of ritual purity and vested authority. These symbols are drawn directly from that profound exposure to the structure of Rabbinic Judaism.
Even though his ultimate religious conversion took a very different path.
A completely different, and you could say a much more explosive path.
The source places the pivot about a decade before he writes this journal entry. A Holy Ghost movement, exorcism, and Holy Clarity epiphany.
Yeah, this was not a gentle shift. This was a violent restructuring of his entire consciousness.
He calls it an ego death.
Yes, and he says it stripped away what he terms lifelong insanity, evil blinding, and then rebuilt his ego using this holy clarity.
So for him, this was a massive psychic shock, a kind of internal revolution.
It cleared the slate, and very significantly, it unblocked memories of past dreams of holy significance, including the one we're about to analyze. The search for a measure, for a plumb line. It becomes an existential necessity for him after this massive ego dissolution.
The resulting religious identity was, specifically, a traditional Catholic religious conversion.
And he emphasizes a focus on pre-1958 continuous self-catechism. So this is of a very specific traditionalist strain of Catholicism he's adopting.
Correct. It represents a search for the purest, most stable foundation possible after the chaos of that ego death.
But this desire for absolute stability, it leads the dreamer into some highly specific and, well, very intense polemics against the rest of the world.
And we have to report these views impartially. It's important for you to understand them because they reveal the internal state that the dream is trying to negotiate.
Absolutely. The dreamer adopts a highly polarized worldview, particularly regarding history and contemporary institutions.
He outlines what he calls the synagogue of death.
It's a very charged term. The assertion is that the last legitimate Judaic sect ended in 70 AD.
And his argument is that those who rejected Christ at that point became, in his words, idol worshippers, turning to soul-murdering untrue, satanic forms of golem idols.
The language is incredibly strong. And this hostility for him, it's not just confined to ancient history.
No, not at all. The source explicitly claims that this synagogue of death influences what he calls corporate dragons.
And by that he means most modern institutions, government, media, academia, who he believes are engaged in what he terms mind-raping, soul-murdering systems.
So again, we're reporting this to show you the scale of the spiritual battlefield this consciousness perceives itself to be on.
Exactly. This context explains why the symbolic struggle in the dream, the open grave, the heavy Plumb-Bob has to be so extreme. The stakes for him are global, not merely personal. He's looking for a measure that's absolute enough to withstand these forces.
And this intensity leads him to develop his own highly specific theological architecture.
One that he himself acknowledges is heretical to traditional Catholic dogma.
Which is fascinating. He's trying to solve the problem of divine justice through what he calls the multiverse soul version apologetic.
This is truly unique. I mean, he challenges the core idea that Jesus Christ suffered and died only once.
What's his argument?
Instead, he argues that Christ incorporates every person's sin-created versions of their soul, including those created by figures like Cain, and hosts these damaged creation versions for divine justice.
So every moment of life and every mass is simultaneously sharing this hosting of suffering across various parallel realities, these soul versions.
That's his model. It's this elaborate theological mechanism to justify both the universality of suffering and the need for a perpetual sacrifice. It ties the individual spiritual efforts directly into a cosmic, multidimensional debt payment.
Wow. That complexity, it just illustrates a consciousness that's desperate to integrate this radical spiritual experience, the ego death, the exorcism, with a really rigorous doctrinal structure.
While also trying to account for all the perceived chaos, the multiverse. It's this intellectual attempt to create a perfect, non-contradictory measure for reality.
The source also included a very highly charged anti-abortion apologetic.
It did. And the dreamer claims this argument is deliberately suppressed by hostile institutions, what he calls the satanic corporate dragon media and the Vatican ape church.
And the argument itself, it sort of bypasses the standard debate on personhood.
It does. It frames abortion instead as allowing women and institutions responsibly mass murder and genociders.
Again, we're just noting this because it reinforces the dreamer's belief that hostile institutions are preventing crucial, high-stakes moral arguments from ever entering the public sphere.
The entire context, the ego death, the search for pre-modern doctrine, the polemics, the heretical additions, it all shows a consciousness that's been violently restructured and is now desperately searching for an uncompromising vertical line in a reality he perceives as falling apart.
And that search perfectly sets the stage for the dream's quest for the Plumb-Bob.
Okay, so now we enter the dream itself. We move from that polemical context into pure symbolism. And the sequence it's like narrative perfection. It moves from community to ritual to solitary vocation.
It does, and Act 1 establishes the scene, death and community. The dreamer is digging his own grave, but the location, as you said, is key.
Right. It's next to the main entrance and exit of his old Quaker boarding high school dorm in that worn, heavily traveled path.
The symbolism is just immediately so potent. It's a chosen will death to the former self.
But it's placed right on the threshold of social interaction, of adolescence, of habit. It's a public, inescapable disruption of the path that everyone else follows.
It's like he's saying, my transformation is now central to your daily life, but it requires my death.
And then the snow begins to fall, nearly covering the open grave.
So you get this sense of purification combined with peril. The snow whitens the ground, which maybe signals a fresh start, a clean slate. But the grave remains. It's an open hazard, an unresolved risk at the foundation of this newly purified landscape.
And from there, the scene shifts. We go to Act 2, the banquet and the unassigned cup.
We move indoors, into the dining hall, but it's been reconfigured to look like a synagogue worship space. Authorities established immediately.
Immediately. The rabbis are sitting at a front table in a Last Supper formation, and they're separated by a banister. They represent pure, inherited tradition, authoritative interpretation.
Halakhic authority.
Exactly. And the dreamer and others, they're positioned near the banister, and they're wearing these uniform white undergarments.
So the white inner layer that would be under the black outer rabbinic garb.
Yes. And that detail about the clothing is so revealing.
How so?
Well, the dreamer is of the house, he's initiated into the spiritual language, but he's in this liminal status. He's prepared for the authority. He's got the white undergarment on, but he's not yet fully vested in the black outer authority of a teacher.
And then the crisis arrives with the ritual drinking. The dreamer lacks a goblet.
And rather than wait or ask, he takes the one unassigned goblet that's just left on the table.
That's the first real act of defiance within this ritual space.
And it draws an immediate authoritative intervention. The central head rabbi warns him that the wine in that goblet is not the same as what the others are having.
It's distinct. It's marked for something singular, maybe even dangerous.
Yet the dreamer drinks it anyway. And the sensation he gets is profoundly unusual. The wine is unusually vividly sweet.
And the source makes a point of noting this is a rare sensory detail in his dreams.
It is, which suggests this sweetness carries immense emotional and psychological weight. It's a moment of unique, defining gratification that he achieved through an act of, partial noncompliance.
Then Act 3, the ascent and the Plumb-Bob burden.
The head rabbi leads the dreamer out into the deepening snow, and they walk right past the open grave.
And the dreamer, thinking practically, he worries someone might fall in and suggests they fill it.
And this is that classic clash between human prudence and a higher command. The rabbi just says, no, leave it open, offers no explanation.
The authority demands that the danger, the vulnerability, the memory of that death to self, it all has to remain exposed.
And the dreamer complies, which shows that authority is still governing his actions, even when it goes against practical reason.
So the path becomes a solo journey. It's isolated, it's uphill, in knee-deep, unplowed snow. This is the vocational struggle.
And this is where the rabbi gives him the large, dense plumb-bob on a rope to drag behind him.
A plumb-bob, which is universally a tool of measure, of straightness, of verticality.
And it immediately becomes a crushing weight. The drag force increases as the ascent gets steeper and the snow gets steeper. The higher the calling, the heavier the weight of the moral standard becomes when it's just dragged passively.
But then, the absolute pivotal act of the entire dream.
The turning point.
Bothered by this increasing resistance, he stops, he walks back, and he makes an autonomous decision. He lifts the plumb-bob up and carries it instead of dragging it.
And the key emotional nugget, the moment that unlocks the whole dream's meaning, is the rabbi's reaction. The source says he seems distinctly surprised by this action.
And as soon as the dreamer shoulders the burden, progress improves immediately. The passive resistance just turns into active forward momentum.
And then finally, the road steepens to a nearly vertical cliff face. The path is literally painted up the rock. The snow disappears.
And crucially, the rabbi is no longer visible.
The external guide is gone. The dreamer is climbing alone, but he's carrying the measure with him.
At the summit, he finds a niche, a small indentation, and he carefully places the plumb-bob burden there.
And he notes the instability of it. It could easily roll back down, but he leaves it there before he descends. The straight measure is established at the highest point, but its placement remains precarious. It's contingent upon his ongoing care.
It's just a remarkable journey from that public death to this solitary ascent. So now, let's hold this narrative up to the light of these great interpretive systems, and let's start with psychology. Okay, so we have this incredible structure that just demands interpretation. The willed self-annihilation of the grave.
The illicit pleasure of the sweet wine.
And the management and moral standards with the plumb-bob. So let's start with Freud's interpretation of this unconscious drama.
Right. The Freudian reading sees the dream as an unconscious theater. It's all about wish fulfillment, repressed conflicts, and the dynamic between the id, the ego, and the superego.
So the grave dug near the dorm, a location of, adolescent social comparison and desire. What does Freud make of that?
It's read as a highly charged fantasy of self-punishment or radical withdrawal. It's a wish to bury some kind of shame or vulnerability from that formative period of his life.
Okay, and the rabbis, in their formal black robes.
They immediately take on the role of the superego. They are the severe, internalized authority structure, often paternal, that dictates moral standards and prohibitions. The voice of, you must not.
which makes the sweet wine a classic symptom of conflict.
Absolutely. The superego warns against that cup because it represents a forbidden pleasure. It's a condensation of an illicit desire. It could be intellectual, erotic, or just the unique gratification of self-chosen distinction.
And the id successfully samples it.
Despite the internalized parental prohibition, and that unique sweetness he experiences, that is the subjective, satisfying sensory experience of that transgression.
That makes the Plumb-Bob pivotal. Dragging that heavy weight behind him through the snow, this resistance that just keeps increasing as he tries to ascend, that sounds like a classic neurotic symptom dragging.
Exactly what it is. The dreamer is unconsciously being pulled down by guilt, by the impossible demands of a harsh internalized standard, which is the superego. The burden is experienced as a passive weight. It's a sign of repression that's crystallized into a psychological drag on any forward momentum.
But the act of lifting it changes everything.
Yeah.
So if dragging it is the neurotic symptom, what is carrying it?
That is the shift to conscious ownership. The ego actively decides to integrate the demands of the superego. It transforms the burden from an external, guilt-producing compulsion into a chosen, active task.
So the burden doesn't disappear.
Not at all. But because the ego chooses it, the energy required shifts from resistance to forward direction, and that makes the weight paradoxically feel lighter.
And the rabbi's surprise. What's the Freudian take on that?
That surprise is the internal authority structure reacting to something unexpected. The superego, which usually only expects either compliance or failure, is confused when the ego finds a creative, autonomous, and self-chosen solution that honors the standard while rejecting the rote, burdensome method.
It's the moment the dreamer achieves psychological autonomy from the internalized parent.
That's it. It's a powerful framework, all based on conflict and desire.
So let's move to Jung, who approaches this from the angle of wholeness and internal mapping. How does the Jungian lens recast these same symbols?
The Jungian reading frames the entire dream as a process of individuation. The goal isn't resolving neurosis. It's integrating the conscious and the unconscious to achieve wholeness, what Jung called the self.
So the open grave isn't self-punishment?
No, it's a voluntary descent into the unconscious, or what he'd call the shadow, where the ego willingly dies to a previous, unintegrated identity. It's a necessary first step.
And the rabbis, they're not just paternal prohibitions anymore.
They shift. They become the council of elders. These are archetypes embodying the collective heritage, the logos, spiritual wisdom. They represent the collective container that's necessary for the ego's transformation to even happen.
Okay, so the sweet wine gets reinterpreted completely then.
Completely. It's no longer an illicit desire. It's a special numinous sacrament offered by the self that deviates from the collective path. The warning isn't a prohibition. It's a recognition that the path of the individuated soul will necessarily be unique and distinct from the norm.
So the sweetness isn't gratification from transgression.
It's the profound emotional draw, the numinosity of aligning with one's unique inner law. It's consolation from destiny, not pleasure from breaking a rule.
That distinction is crucial, and this leads us to the Plumb-Bob.
In Jungian terms, it's far more than just a moral standard. It's an axis mundi symbol. It's the cosmic axis that establishes the straight line between above the self, heaven, and below the unconscious, the earth.
So dragging it is a clumsy, incomplete, and burdensome relationship with one's true vocation.
It's the ego trying to follow its inner map while still being anchored to material resistance, to the collective unconscious.
Therefore, the act of lifting and carrying the Plumb-Bob is the ego's conscious, active cooperation with the self's demand.
Yes. The personal will finally aligns with that deeper vertical axis, allowing the energy of the unconscious to flow without friction.
And when the dreamer carries the Plumb-Bob, the rabbi disappears.
Which signals that the external guide is no longer needed. Why? Because the principle of guidance has been internalized. The self has been successfully integrated into the conscious personality.
The ascent up the vertical cliff face is the realization of the heroic self, and the final act lodging the Plumb-Bob precariously in that niche.
That represents the temporary constellation of the self. The vertical axis is established, the measure is set, but its fragility reminds the ego that integration requires constant vigilance. It's not a one-and-done deal.
All right, so now let's move to the most contemporary view, stripping away the deep history and focusing on the dream as a function of the brain itself. Contemporary dream research and adaptive problem solving.
In this framework, the dream isn't about deep symbolic conflict or archetypes. It's about the brain running simulations to rehearse coping mechanisms for high-stakes emotional and social problems.
So what problems is the brain rehearsing here?
The dream organizes three key problems: mortality, social belonging, and moral obligation. The open grave, and especially the refusal to fill it, rehearses the need to tolerate unresolved risk and vulnerability.
The dreamer's anxiety that someone might fall in is the fear that his unresolved past or his internal conflict might harm others.
And the authoritative instruction to leave the grave open forces the dreamer's mind to simulate living with chronic, visible vulnerability rather than seeking a quick, comforting resolution. It's a simulation for resilience against the urge to hide one's true, sometimes dangerous state.
So what about the sweet wine in this model?
In this view, it could be interpreted as a novel reward pathway. It's a highly salient, unexpected, positive outcome that was achieved through a slightly non-standard path taking the unassigned cup. The brain flags this as a successful risk-reward negotiation.
And the Plumb-Bob dragging under the snow is the simulation of an optimization problem.
Exactly, recognizing an invisible, increasing resistance. And the solution picking it up demonstrates crucial cognitive flexibility and agency.
The brain recognizes that the passive strategy, the dragging, is inefficient, and so it actively restructures the problem to carry.
And this successful restructuring is encoded as a positive action. The rabbi's surprise is the brain's internal monitoring system flagging a successful deviation from rote habit. The simulation found an optimal, creative solution to the burden that the traditional parameters, the rabbi, the superego, they just didn't account for.
That's fascinating. So the psychological systems, they all agree on the shift from passive compliance to active ownership.
They do, but they define the nature of the drag differently. It's either Freudian guilt, Jungian non-alignment, or just contemporary cognitive inefficiency.
And the niche on the cliff face is the ultimate simulation outcome.
It's a model for risk management. You manage the obligation, the Plumb-Bob, by setting the standard high and precisely, but you acknowledge it has to remain contingent and monitored, not fixed and forgotten.
Okay, if we move from the psychic landscape to the metaphysical and doctrinal structure, we see how these internal struggles are mapped onto divine order. This is where it gets more dense, but the insights become the most targeted. Let's start with the traditional KWGlc Pascal mystery reading.
This reading is incredibly powerful because it overlays the dream directly onto the structure of Christ's sacrifice and the process of justification.
So the open grave is immediately interpreted as what?
As free cooperation with grace, a willed readiness, a voluntary imitatio Christi to be buried with Christ in the death to self. It corresponds to the foundational configuration of baptism.
Which means the instruction to leave it open becomes the necessary continuation of the Via Crucis.
Precisely. The grave must remain exposed as the scandal of the cross, something willed by divine providence. Your natural human prudence, which wants safety and closure, is overruled by the higher theological demand to live with this visible, central vulnerability.
And the setting, the synagogue dining hall, is viewed through the lens of typology.
Right. The Jewish worship room prefigures the Eucharistic meal, and the sweet, distinct wine from that unassigned cup signifies a singular election or vocation. It's a unique path, a non-standard modality of participation in Christ's own cup of suffering.
And what about the sweetness? What is that in this reading?
That is interpreted as suavitas. It's the spiritual sweetness or profound experiential consolation of grace that draws the soul toward a more demanding path.
It's God's way of making a uniquely heavy burden palatable or even desirable.
Exactly. It's the intrinsic lure of grace.
So the burden itself, the Plumb-Bob, dragging it up that snowy path, what does that correspond to?
That corresponds to living under the law with what the church calls imperfect charity.
Okay, what does that mean?
Dragging is motivated by servile fear, fear of punishment, or just mere legalistic observance. The law is known and respected, but the motivation is external, hence the friction and the immense drag. It's the heavy weight of obligation without the proper inner fuel.
So the transition, the moment of lifting it, is the key here.
The act of carrying the Plumb-Bob is defined as the fulfillment of the new law through the gratia spiritus sancti cordi data.
Okay, that's a highly technical, but it sounds like a deeply beautiful concept. Let's unpack that phrase for the listener.
It means, literally, the grace of the Holy Spirit given to the heart. This is the inner gift that informs both the will and the intellect.
So when charity, pure love of God informs your observance, the yoke becomes sweet and the burden becomes light.
Just as Christ promised. The act of carrying represents filial service, which is service motivated by love, not by fear. It transforms the standard from an external drag to an internal joyful drive.
So where Freud saw guilt dissolving, Catholicism sees caritas charity, love being perfected, allowing the soul to move beyond mere compliance.
And the rabbi's surprise just underscores this elevation. The act of caring is a free gift. It's a result of grace that transcends what the law alone, represented by the rabbi's external authority, could ever mandate or even anticipate.
It's grace exceeding legal expectation.
Exactly.
So let's shift gears to the Second Temple rabbinic symbolism. How is this internal struggle mapped onto the authority of the Torah?
Well, the environment is already set by his Hasidic influence. The dreamer in the white undergarments is in a liminal status.
He's of the house. He's initiated, but not yet fully vested with the authority to interpret or teach the halakha, the Jewish law.
Right. The rabbis are the interpretive authority, the living tradition of the Torah. And the open grave, placed centrally in the path, might be seen as a necessary ritual space, a place of purification or a symbolic rejection of the Yetzer Hara.
The evil inclination.
Yes. The evil inclination that existed in his past community life. It has to remain open as a constant reminder of the radical break that's required.
And the sweet cup is particularly significant here. It's a liminal, unassigned portion.
It could represent a unique interpretation of Torah or a non-standard path of service that doesn't fit the collective allotment. It's distinct, potentially risky because it's unprescribed, but it represents a distinctive, intense share in the tradition or a specific mandate.
And the Plumb-Bob. That recalls direct prophetic imagery.
It does, especially from the book of Amos, where God uses a plumb line to assess Israel's faithfulness and its rectitude.
So drying it is the immense, heavy work of carrying the norm of Torah through a confusing, unfaithful culture.
The deepening snow. It's the burden of legal and ethical adherence that feels like an external drag, because the culture offers no footing or help.
So the shift lifting the Plumb-Bob is the transition from being passively burdened by legal norms to actively appropriating them.
That is the core insight. The law moves from being an external imposition, the drag, to being an internal active commitment. The dreamer integrates the Torah internally, making it an intrinsic part of his own movement.
And the rabbi's surprise here is the tension between the strict adherence demanded by legal tradition and this sudden, self-willed, personalized engagement with the divine measure.
It's a beautiful way to put it.
This shift toward an internal, self-willed measure is the perfect springboard for the most abstract analysis we have, the Thomistic metaphysical commentary.
Right. This lens ignores the Freudian unconscious and the specific religious history. It focuses only on the objective structures of measure, being, and participation.
So this is an inquiry into the nature of movement itself. For Aquinas, the dream is an imaginal likeness.
A picture that the intellect uses to grasp a deeper, abstract, intelligible structure. And the Plumb-Bob is the ratio of measure, the standard of rectitude that every finite being must participate in to be aligned with the eternal law.
So let's define what dragging the Plumb-Bob means metaphysically.
Dragging it means the law is known by the intellect, but it's not yet connaturalized. The law is acknowledged, but it's extrinsic and imposed. The will doesn't yet have the stable disposition to perform the act easily. The soul is in a state of potency toward virtue, but it hasn't fully actualized it.
The decision to pick up and carry the Plumb-Bob must then be the moment of actualization.
It is the move from an extrinsic, imposed measure to intrinsic form. This is the metaphysical definition of habitus inhering in the soul.
Okay, let's break down habitus.
Think of it as a stable quality, like spiritual muscle memory, that disposes a power, like the will, well toward its perfect act. By carrying the Plumb-Bob, the dreamer moves the potency into act, and when the measure becomes internal habitus, motion becomes swifter.
That is a stunning explanation of agency. The measure of truth, once it's internalized, ceases to be friction and becomes the very definition of efficient movement.
Exactly. The rabbi's surprise, in this context, is simply the excess of virtue over the requirement of the law, the elevation that exceeds what pure extrinsic pedagogy can guarantee. It confirms that the dreamer is operating not just by rule, but by an internal, perfected disposition.
And the physical environment of the ascent also gains clarity here. The climb up the painted cliff face, where the snow disappears.
That's the necessary move from confused, sensible impediments, the snow and the drag, to the clear, arduous demands of a purely intelligible ascent.
And finally, that precarious niche near the summit where the Plumb-Bob is set.
This confirms the fragility of created participation. No matter how perfected the habitus is, it's a created quality, and so it's contingent. The plumb line remains defeasible in this pilgrim state, the status viatoris.
So the dream is a compact metaphysical parable. The dreamer has successfully internalized the higher measure, but he's constantly reminded that he is still a pilgrim, and his earned rectitude is vulnerable to falling away. So this extensive journey through theology, philosophy, psychology, it's revealed a remarkable coherence. When we look across all 5 of these readings, what is the single overarching story they all seem to agree on?
The synthesis is, well, it's pretty unequivocal. The central narrative is the move from a passive, burdensome external relationship with a standard, whether you call it the law, the superego, or the measure,
To an active, lighter relationship where the individual owns that standard internally.
We see the Freudian ego choosing conscious ownership over neurotic drag. We see the Jungian self achieving alignment with the axis mundi. We see the Catholic soul transitioning to gratia spiritus sancti, that love-fueled service.
And the Thomist developing intrinsic habitus. All roads lead to agency replacing rote compliance.
Which elevates the detail of the rabbi's surprise to the critical nexus of the entire dream. It defines the boundary between external rule and integrated virtue.
Authority is surprised precisely when the subject moves beyond mere rule following, just dragging the weight to creative, free, and autonomous ownership.
Choosing to carry the weight.
Yeah.
It suggests that true moral or spiritual advancement always exceeds the expectations of established external systems.
It's the moment of self-legislation, of the dreamer becoming the source of the effort, not just the recipient of the command. And this autonomy, paradoxically, is what makes the ascent successful.
And we have to return to the open grave. The refusal to fill it in is a necessary command across all the lines, psychological and theological.
The death to self, that required renunciation of the past life, has to remain an open, visible vulnerability or risk.
Placed right in the center of ordinary life and social traffic. It must not be neatly resolved or sealed away for comfort.
This creates a permanent state of tension for the dreamer, doesn't it? He establishes this absolute high, stable measure at the summit with the Plumb-Bob.
But he has to simultaneously live with an open, dangerous vulnerability at the foundation with the grave. Both the measure and the risk must be perpetually exposed.
And it connects right back to the beginning, that moment of singular election and risk. The sweet wine. The tension in that singular cup really holds the key to the entire enterprise.
It does. We have systematically dissected how a single symbolic object, the Plumb-Bob, functions simultaneously as a psychological burden, a theological measure, and a metaphysical habitus.
The tension remains, and this is the final provocative thought we want to leave with you. We have the external objective measure, the Plumb-Bob's verticality, and the internal subjective experience, the profound sweetness of the wine.
So is the intense sweetness of that wine a sign of grace drawing you to a singular, non-standard vocation? Or is it merely the psychological pleasure of finally affirming a unique, chosen identity in defiance of external rule?
Which perspective, the psychological model of ego ownership or the theological model of divine grace, provides the most useful alignment for interpreting and setting the straight measures in your own life? The journey is always solitary, but the interpretations are universally shared.
Until next time.
That's all for this deep dive.